The Hidden Holocaust, a genocide nearly twice to 3 times the size of Hitler's campaign to exterminate the Jews. Belgium's King Leopold II was responsible for the death of 10 to 15 million people from 1885 to 1908, in what is today known as the Democratic Republic of Congo.
In 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced, exiled, or forced to flee their homes. Hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed, and their inhabitants made refugees.
Now, the British ruling class was to blame for the deaths of up to 1 million people during the Great Famine in Ireland, and as many more were forced to emigrate because a foreign blight had turned the potato crop into rotten, stinking, putrefying mush.
This is how white Australians celebrated 150 years of settlement, which black Australians would describe as invasion.
Before Captain Phillip lands, Lieutenant Ball takes a boatload of Marines ashore to keep the natives in check.
It may be that this country will become the most valuable acquisition Britain has ever made.
Armenians were rounded up from towns and cities and forced to march across the Anatolian countryside through desert conditions. Up to 1.5 million people perished.
German anti-Nazis were the first victims. Their numbers swelled to include citizens of all the nations of Europe. Their fate is described by witness Rudolf Höss. I was in command at Auschwitz until December 1st, 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were exterminated there by gassing and burning. The rest of the victims were approximately 100,000 German Jews, and a great many citizens, mostly Jews, from Holland, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and other countries.
Good evening, and of course it's Red Line because it's Monday evening. And tonight we're looking at the second programme in our series, if you'd like to call it that, on Holocaust. And we're asking questions tonight. We're asking questions like, what is the purpose of genocides? Now, we all know that each genocide is unique, but what is it that links them together? What's the commonality? Is there any commonality? And what are the historical and material causes and purposes of these seemingly unlinked events? Of course, many of them have been made relatively invisible, and we barely know about them and barely commemorate them. And tonight we are in part also going to be doing that.
And we want to look at, as Jackie said, some of the reasons for genocide. I think what they all have in common is that it's not just hate or something irrational, but they're very often very serious material and historical reasons. For example, the transition to capitalism, which was long, bloody, and contested. And of course, we can't look at all genocide because once you start looking, there are so many. For example, the extermination of much of indigenous people in the Americas and Australasia. We won't have time to look at that. But in Americas, for example, 55 million people were killed, and that is a huge number. But we won't have time to deal with all of them. But we want to look at a few of these genocides and see what it says about capitalism, but also the transition capitalism and genocide in general. So the first person we want to welcome is Grattan Paxson, who's a campaigner for Sinti and Roma rights. Thank you very much for joining us, Grattan. I don't know if you had a chance to look at last week's program. We focused on the Jewish Holocaust because it had been politicized so much over the last 6 or 7 years. But today we want to also look at non-Jewish victims, especially Roma and Sinti. And there's the estimate that 250 to 500,000 Roma and Sinti killed by Hitler. And it was only in 1982 that West Germany formally recognized this as a genocide against the Romani people and the Sinti. Before that, they often claimed, they weren't targeted for racial reasons like Jews, they were targeted for criminal reasons by the Nazis. Why do you think there's such a different treatment of, when it comes to Jewish people and Roma and Sinti as part of the Nazi Holocaust?
Each year we had been holding campaigns in Hyde Park, that is annual commemorations, And the very earliest commemoration, in fact, gone back to 1967. So we were already commemorating, but not being recognized as commemorators, as well as not being very put into a second-class position as, as victims of the Holocaust. Now, I knew quite a lot about this because after the First World Romany Congress in London, I was in process of writing a book which came out eventually as The Destiny of Europe's Gypsies. And that was the first standard work that brought together the facts of the Holocaust as it happened to the Gypsy people across Europe. And of course, it was a very grim picture. It was at a time when there were still people alive that I could talk to. So we got some kind of full picture. I had spent a lot of time in Yugoslavia. I knew about the terrible Cenovas concentration camp. That's something people haven't heard much about, but probably more Gypsy people died in that Cenovas camp in Croatia. And that was, of course, the Nazi puppet state of Croatia, fascist state. We don't know even today what the full picture was, but it was a terrible camp. I made a lot of notes this morning, putting together the picture of why Roma in this country, that means the older Gypsy community and the younger Roma migrants, have been kept out of the Holocaust story. And it does seem that this is pretty deliberate. It started, of course, with David Cameron, who appointed the UK Holocaust Commission. It was called his Holocaust Commission, in fact. It was referred to in that way. And what he didn't do was appoint any Rom representative or Rom person who would be serving on that, and we felt he should have done.
Can I ask you, sort of the political context is quite important, isn't it? I don't believe it's about numbers necessarily, because there were more Jews who were killed or more. I think it's a political difference, isn't it, to how Holocausts are being used politically and agency. I mean, you know, we discussed last week how Israel made a concerted attempt to establish the Holocaust industry for various political reasons. Yeah. And there isn't such an agency, perhaps, for Roma and Sinti. I mean,
the Roma people were not organized. That's it. The Jewish state, the Jewish organizations in America and so on, much more powerful, and could not bring forward the case for recognition that we tried to establish.
Grattan, can I just clarify?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
For the people who are listening, because I think this is the really important point, which is that the Roma people were the only people alongside the Jews,
that's right,
who were singled out by the Nazis for total extermination. So in that, there is absolute parity. It's, of course, very difficult to know numbers or to understand what numbers mean when you're talking about a community that travels. But what we have now is, after more than 20 years of Holocaust Memorial Day, and remembering in part I was expelled for making a comment like this, that actually what we're left with is that there is still no representation on the executive of Holocaust Memorial Day for Gypsy, Roma and traveling people. Is that right?
Holocaust Memorial Day is a completely different thing, that January event. Yeah, we have taken part in that, but what we haven't got is somebody on the board of what's now called Holocaust Memorial Foundation. They got a £50 million fund. And what we were very interested in, but it's never happened, is that with the learning center, which they want to create, we said, okay, that would be good because we want to be part of your genocide watch. But that has never happened. So, you know, that was another blow to us along those lines.
Can I just ask if you get any interest from the media about this disparity at all?
No, I would say pretty quickly, I can say no.
The Jewish Holocaust and the way it's being celebrated has very little to do with the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but a lot with allowing Israel to carry on its policies in the Middle East undisturbed by making it, seemingly a special victim category, and because there is no Romani state that commits crimes against the Palestinians or other, there isn't that same kind of dynamic going on. But I was going to ask you about the situation today, because officially Roma, Sinti and travelers are protected from discrimination by the Equality Act in 2010. On the other hand, we've just seen the new policing bill, which singles out travelers and makes what was until now a civil offense, that parking on unauthorized land as was a civil offense, has now been turned into a crime. And the police can take away the cars, the trailers, the vehicles, and fine each adult up to £2,500. But of course, there isn't much authorized land for Romani and Gypsies and travelers to go to. Is that correct?
That is right. I should just say that, because if you're looking across Europe, the majority of Roma are not traveling, except a lot of being pushed onto the road again by economic and racial reasons of discrimination and so on. There are out there numerous extreme right-wing formations which are hunting down Gypsies at this time. A few years ago, it was the Hungarian National Guard, which was bombing Gypsy houses in Hungary. Numbers of people died. There was a fight back about that. There was an attempt to form a Roma Guard, and about 800 members listed up for that, because it was quite quickly suppressed by police action and prosecutions. Of course, in Ukraine, it's the Azov Brigade, and we have very disturbing pictures and people telling us from Ukraine of being hunted down by the Azov Brigade. Perhaps they're too busy now defending the towns, but a couple of years back they were breaking into Gypsy camps and going through the woods and persecuting and killing people all over the place in Ukraine. That was very, very serious. But the most serious and the greatest and horror that has happened is a war on the Romani people in Kosovo during 1998-9, when the Kosovo Liberation Army was set out in an operation to expel all Roma from the then province of Kosovo. 90% of Roma were expelled. 14,000 houses were deliberately set on fire and looted. There were murders and rapes happening all over the place. And the result was that after 600 years sojourn in Kosovo, 90% of Roma were expelled, and there are now 150,000 Roma and their children, looking at the next generation as well, around Europe, many stateless and having great difficulties. And it was on that issue that we came together recently to form what's called the Coalition Roma Rights.
Perhaps you could send us some more information about this alliance. It would be very useful to put it out to the audience. It's also, it's quite shocking that expulsions are still happening. This goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, transition to capitalism. Thank you very much for joining us, Grattan. I'm sorry, we have to leave it there. We've got a few other speakers waiting. And we've got another show next week talking about issues coming from this show. So if you're free, you could join us next week as well. That'd be great. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, Corinne.
In terms of continuing this conversation, I'm going to now turn to our next guest, Professor Kahinde Andrews, who I'm very pleased to welcome tonight to our program. Professor Andrews specializes in Black Studies at the University of Birmingham. Many of you will have known him or his work or read his work because he's an author of many books. He's an activist. He writes for the Guardian at times, and he's made a number of TV appearances as well. So can we just start, Kahinde, by saying hi? Great to see you tonight.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, good to be here. So I've been on Zoom all day, so I'm a bit...
You're zoomed out.
Yeah.
Zoomed out. First, I'm going to start with a bit of historical perspective, really. In terms of the African Holocaust. I have to be careful of saying that because you may know, Kahinde, that was one of the reasons I was expelled from the Labour Party, was daring to call it the African Holocaust. But with the African Holocaust, what kind of part do you think that had to play with the transition of Europe into capitalism? How important was it?
Well, I mean, you want to say the ranking importance is definitely up there. I mean, you think about historically that movement towards the West, which is what I call it the West, and everybody, it's not necessarily why it's called the West, but when Europe goes westward and finds the Americas, you know, that is the thing that unlocks progress, right? Prior to 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Europe was in a dark age. It was relatively backwards compared to most of the world. And, you know, every serious historian would say that what they call the Atlantic system is the linchpin through which everything else comes through. If you think the first commodities that build capitalism is silver and it's gold, which is predominantly Portugal and Spain, in Brazil. And then after that, it's tobacco. And then after that, it's sugar. And then after that, it's cotton. I mean, those are the key commodities that build not only the Industrial Revolution, but finance capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. And every single one of them came from the so-called Atlantic system. That's a nice way to say African Holocaust, Marfa, Mangamese, some of the words that we use. But literally, without that 300-year exploitation of black flesh, which killed, I mean, the estimates vary, but it's definitely in the tens of millions, could even be hundreds of millions. Without that exploitation, which killed that many people, there literally is no capitalism. It's not possible to have capitalism without that. So it's absolutely foundational to everything that we currently have.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, in particular socialists, misunderstand that, so that they kind of view being anti-racist in a kind of paternalistic sort of view. We have to be kind of nice to our poor, dark comrades, you know, rather than understanding actually that Black people have been at the forefront of this struggle, because as we know, Black people were the first people who were totally commodified by capitalism, weren't they?
Yeah, and I think that, well, I mean, the thing Holocaust is an interesting word because kind of the original sin is the Native American Holocaust, which is 65 million people. It's 98% of some entire populations that clears the earth for Europe to go in. And then, then it's the enslavement of African people, the reduction to commodities. And, you know, when we think about the thing that we really miss when we think about slavery is that it isn't, I mean, the act of enslaving somebody is terrible, and you can see that in different parts of the world, right? And historically, but Europe does something very different where we enslave them become commodities. And actually the value isn't even in owning the enslaved, the value is in what the enslaved produce for free. And that's that gap of wealth that is produced, which allows Europe to become dominant, allows the West, allows America to exist. And that is the key point. So when we talk about racism, whether or not you like me because I'm Black is kind of irrelevant. Racism is the political economy. White supremacy is the basis for the economic order. And the best way to, I mean, the most simple illustration of this, and I do this with 16-year-olds all the time in school, is look at a map of global inequality. You will find the places where the Black people live, so-called sub-Saharan Africa, are the poorest, and the places where white people live, the West, are the richest, and there is a hierarchy in between. What more evidence do you need that today in 21st century is still the same logic, and it is actually the basis of the economy, not about your individual attitudes.
Can I ask you something? Sorry, Jackie. Anybody who has a child knows that you have to learn racism. Children are born colorblind to a degree. They don't care what color their friend has. How important do you think the construction of racism was to establish capitalism, and still is to a degree?
Well, yeah, but the thing is, it's learned because it's all around us, right? So if the basic idea of white supremacy is that white people are better, well, actually, you can see that evidence everywhere, right? Because white people have more money, right? Have more advancement, they are less likely to die, et cetera, et cetera. So it's literally structured all around us that you can see these inequalities. And even in the UK, I mean, I did this. Actually, I was driving through London the other day.
Yeah.
Yesterday, actually, and it's so like I'm talking to my kids about this as I'm driving through the city, and I'm going through Knightsbridge, and it's all white people and it's all nice.
Yeah.
And then literally you cross the road, and all of a sudden everybody is Black and brown. There's rubbish on the streets. It's run down, and you're like, well, look, that's how you get structured into racism, because the reality creates that. Racism creates that reality, and then that reinforces the idea that we're inferior, and you can see that really everywhere you turn.
Yeah, I was going to say that in terms of what you were saying about the global divide, because in fact you see that in the United States and you see that in the United Kingdom, because of course what I feel, I don't know, what do you think? about the fact that actually what we have is skin color being used as, in fact, a signifier for class. I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't racism. It means there is, but that's, for me, the way that we need to understand what the basis of racism is.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's what essentially has happened with racism, is we've reduced it to individual prejudice. So that you can't really get rid of individual prejudice. There's always some people who don't like other people, but what racism is the structure. It's the fact that those prejudices become the reality, right? So that, I mean, black male youth unemployment in this country is 40%, and it was 40% when the riots happened in 1981. Like, it hasn't actually improved at all. And so that's the other thing that we do with racism, because individual prejudice has certainly declined, and you can have, you know, it's pretty unlikely, given the statistics actually, that I'm a professor today. There's only 150 of us in the whole entire country. So few black professors that we can't all get on a plane together, just in case there's an accident and there'll be none of us left, right? So, I mean, it's pretty unlikely today, but 40 years ago, forget about it. There's no chance I'm where I am. And so because those individual prejudices have declined, and because some people have managed to get into higher positions, we've kind of think that racism has got better. But if you actually look at the underlying things, the economic issues, poverty, look in the UK, in the US, and look globally, actually nothing's really changed. It's still exactly the same problems.
Can I ask you about this changing nature of racism? It's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, it was crucial in the transition to capitalism. Racism was constructed by the ruling class and laws were established to it. I mean, things have changed somewhat officially. You know, the British state is anti-racist. It's got anti-racist laws coming out of its ears, etc. So racism has changed a little bit, isn't it? The function of it has somewhat changed. How do you see that?
Well, no, I'd say it's not really changed. It looks a bit different, but really it's kind of the same, right? So if you think about what was that from 1492, the basic logic was black and brown life is disposable to make white life better, right? And that's exactly what we see today. And if you look at the global inequality, you can see it very, very clearly. Why is it that our clothes are made in China and in Asia? Because we can pay them wages that would never be accepted here, right? How do we get the resources to make these laptops, etc.? We just steal them from Africa, and we don't pay a proper wage, right? So actually, if you look at that basic logic, it's still the same. I mean, what's happened is, and even the idea that there'll be some black and brown people who are slightly better off, that's not new either. Like, the British Empire couldn't have run without black and brown people facilitating the British Empire. It wouldn't have been possible. What we see more now in Britain, because we're here and because we moved here, etc., and in lots of ways, and actually this government's a good example where diversity is used to hide the fact of the logics of racism. So you get someone like Priti Patel to bring in the most racist immigration laws the country's ever seen by far, because she's Asian is fine, right? Or you have in America a black president who doesn't improve anything for black people. Like literally not one indicator got better under Obama, but we all somehow celebrate having a black president. So actually one of the new functions now is that you put a black or brown face on it and it justifies the underlying racism.
So if I say to you identity politics, what would you say back to me?
The right play the identity politics perfectly. In fact, there's no other reason to explain why Boris Johnson is in power than identity politics, isn't it? I don't see what else there is. And it's always given to people like me who talk about black politics, black radicalism, but that's the complete opposite. The right, certainly since Thatcher at least, has really rallied around this idea of whiteness, identity, protect the flag, protect the nation, etc., in order to get into power and do things which are bad for lots of poor white people, right? And the only way you can explain something like Brexit, or again why Boris Johnson's elected, and I wouldn't even be surprised if he ran again, he'd still be elected, is because of this really strong white racist identity politics, which holds that whole project together.
Well, you know what strikes me though as well is that we're not just talking about a Tory thing here. I mean, my experience of the Labour Party, I'm afraid, was that I had to face a lot of racism. And certainly the leadership we have at the moment makes it absolutely clear to me that there is a hierarchy of racism and Black people are pretty much at the bottom of it. Not quite at the bottom, but pretty much at the bottom of it. Why does the establishment, you know, thinking in terms of the fact that, as far as I can see, racism was established in order to allow colonialism, imperialism, and the theft of I'm not quite sure what's happened there. Okay, and the theft of raw resources, raw materials to occur. How will we ever get out of this situation in terms of racism? Is there a way out of it?
Is there? So not within the current framework. And this is the problem with the Labour Party. Is the Labour Party, if you're playing on this playing field, which says, how do we reform it? Can we change it? Can we try and tweak it? You're always going to fall into that trap. And what you find is the Labour Party have done this since kind of Tony Blair, but certainly now, there's a kind of clear racist identity politics, which you can see from the right that has worked. So we'll try and copy it. And that's essentially what they do. They try and copy it, right? Because you're still playing that same game. The only way to overcome that is not to play the game, right? It's to do something which is very, 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 very different. And I think these pictures are people hacking in, right? To
yes, yeah, they are. I mean, I have to tell you, Kahinde, I see that as a sign of how scared they are of us. Every time they do something like put a swastika in front of us, it just says to us that we're on the right line. So just please keep speaking.
Yeah, I'll just carry on. So, so the only way really is to reject it, and the left hasn't really done this. And let's be, if we're 100% honest, the Labour movement has always been slightly conservative. Has always even has that kind of. There's a big strand of that identity politics behind it. Think about. I mean, I remember watching Ken Loach's Spirit of 45 and say, "Where are all the black and brown people? Like, you think we don't exist, right?" So there is a kind of reactionary whiteness behind a lot of Labour, not all of Labour movement, obviously. So I'm not really surprised. It's the kind of thing I think I would expect to see from parliamentary politics in general.
I'm really sorry about this, Kahinde. I don't even know how he's doing this. Because...
Listen, Tina, we're just going to go on with it.
Okay.
People can see what's happening. And actually, I think that is very useful to see what's happening now. So if anybody wants to take any screenshots of that, I think it would be great because I would love to use it. Kahinde, given what we have today, given the struggle that we have as Black people, as socialists, as people who want to see more equality, what do we do? How do we get, I mean, you know, like you, I would see myself as having been amongst those very few people who have managed to become sort of middle class. But that's not so for most of us. What do we do? What do we practically do? And what about the place of the left in this?
Well, I think the important thing to do is really to understand just what the stakes of the problem here are. And when we think about racism, it is to understand that actually diversity, having a diverse middle class or a diverse government doesn't mean anything. You actually look at the underlying indicators and they're all as bad as they've ever been, right? So I think that's important. And then it is really important to say, look, we have to have, revolution is the only solution here. It doesn't work. You can't, I'm not saying don't vote Labour or whatever. I always vote Labour because it's better than the other thing, but that's not the solution, right? That's the only solution, is to completely transform our political and economic system. And that is what we need to be doing. And that means organizing a different way of living, a different way of understanding, a different politics. I mean, look, my politics is the politics of Black radicalism, which is particularly specific, but there's lots of other revolutionary politics which we can get involved in and get engaged in. We can't keep look, the key thing I always say here is society, the fact that we keep having, I can give you all the statistics about racism today, and they're not that different than they were. That isn't an example of the system not working. That's an example of the logic of the system. And if we're actually anti-racist, that means we have to be anti-capitalist, we have to be anti this political and economic system. And there is no compromise on that at all. And so if we're building alternatives, then we're doing the right thing. If we're trying to fix this thing, that's just a hamster wheel that's not going to get us anywhere in the long run.
Kahinde, you are saying music to my ears. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I hope you'll come on and talk to us again.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yes, and sorry about that. That was a bit stressful. There was somebody joined it 15 times and somehow managed to screen share, although it's switched off. Don't ask me how. We are going to talk to Kevin Bean now, who is a lecturer, semi-retired lecturer on Irish politics. And we want to talk to him about the Irish Famine. hello, Kevin. Thank you for joining us. So the Irish famine is perhaps a strange one in that, it's a natural occurrence. The potato crop was ruined. Does it deserve a place in our program on the genocide? And if so, why?
Well, thanks, Tina, for inviting me along this evening. The potato blight is a natural occurrence, but the famine and the response to the famine was definitely man-made. So I think it certainly deserves being considered as not just simply a natural disaster, and above all, not being considered simply, quote, the potato famine, as if this is, some sort of sudden blight. The economic and the social and the political structures of Ireland in the 19th century definitely caused both the death from starvation and disease and the emigration of large numbers of Irish people. The population of Ireland at the beginning of the 19th century was around about 8 million, and fairly conservative estimates suggest that about 1 million people died in the period 1845 to 52, and then around about another 1 million emigrated. Ireland is probably one of the few countries in the world whose population is now lower than it was 200 years ago, and it's only just now starting to creep up towards the 6-7 million figure. So it's clearly not just a natural disaster. Political decisions that were made in how to deal with the famine were important, but also land ownership, the role of the landlords, and indeed the capitalist economy that we've heard this evening also contributed to those large numbers of deaths as well.
So, because genocide does imply a certain intent, and so while obviously I don't think the British ruling class intended to kill a lot of Irish people, there was a certain ideological reason for perhaps not intervening as much as they could have. Do you think?
Yeah, I think the ideology is important. We have a number of examples of that. The famine period is covered by two governments, Sir Robert Peel's and Lord John Russell's, and it's in the middle of quite a big ideological battle about the Corn Laws, about protectionism, and also about the nature of the capitalist economy, particularly the so-called laissez-faire ideology, and Lord John Russell's government is very much associated with that. So the idea of intervening in any type of natural economic pattern is very much frowned upon. Peel's government, for example, does send some food supplies, and these food supplies, the so-called Indian corn, maize, and so forth, are part of this process of a form of intervention. But it's really under Russell that the laissez-faire ideology really kicks in. And this is because the argument is that if you intervene in the market and you actually provide foodstuffs, you will therefore interfere with the normal workings of the market, so that starving people who don't really have access to a cash economy, it's argued, they're going to be encouraged to stay on these benefits. They're going to be encouraged to stay on government support. And of course, you're going to undercut the prices of food manufacturers. There is an important element, though, in terms of strategy and ideology. And there is clearly an element in many of the responses of the government and other parts of the ruling class, which suggests that this is often referred to as the sort of providential explanation, as it were, that this is an opportunity for the restructuring. It's a brilliant word. It's very noticeable that other, people who, when they're attempting to carry out quite destructive and horrific policies, often use euphemisms of this sort. But it's the idea of the restructuring of the Irish countryside, that that the ruling class can remove large numbers of people. It can change production from tillage to pasture, particularly the more profitable cattle production. So the idea is that this population is it's often a subsistence farming class. It's often living on marginal land. It's often at quite a low level of subsistence. So the famine is an opportunity to clear those people, to encourage their emigration, often with assisted passages, admittedly, but it's a way of restructuring the Irish countryside. Also, in terms of the providentialism, Trevelyan, one of the bureaucrats in the Treasury, seemed to argue that the famine was in some sense a punishment, a judgment on the fecklessness of the Irish population. So there were quite long-standing racist attitudes, I think, deployed in that, and also a sense that that Ireland needed to be modernised. It needed its capitalist economy needed to grow, and these people stood in the way of that.
Yeah. In terms of locating this disaster in the rise of capitalism, it might be quite interesting because it's got a lot to do with the land question, isn't it? You mentioned the Corn Laws. There's also the issue of and I'm not quite sure if it was the same in Ireland as it was in Britain when it comes to introducing capitalism, doing away with the commons land and privatizing the land and dividing it up and basically destroying anything that stands in the way of that. Was that similar in Ireland in the transition to capitalism?
No, the Irish land system is radically very different. Ireland is in many ways really very much a place apart, both in terms of capitalist development but political development. It was essentially conquered and restructured in a series of wars and conquests in the 16th and 17th century. So, for example, the native ruling class, the Irish Catholic ruling class, were expelled from the land, and in certain parts of Ireland, settlers were introduced into the country, and so the character of both agriculture and society in those areas was changed. Not just in the Ulster counties, which are most well known, but even in some parts of the Midlands and into the south as well. So you have a capitalist development which is actually clearly linked to conquest and, in fact, dispossession, and the transfer of land ownership from an Irish ruling class to essentially an English ruling class, although by the 19th century, many of them have been occupying the land for a couple of hundred years. So they're often referred to as Anglo-Irish, but they are in religion generally Protestant, and their interests are very much tied up with those of the British state. They have quite close interests with the Conservative Party as it will develop in the 19th century. But the other, it means then that the type of farming patterns that you see in England, particularly with enclosure, with tenant farmers of that sort, they do exist, for example, in parts of Ulster and in parts of Leinster, Munster, the more prosperous areas that are more closely integrated into the British economy. So you've got a cash economy, you've got the export of foodstuffs from Ireland into England, and indeed that goes on during the famine. In this period, Ireland still remains a net exporter of food. So you've got that type of economy, but then in the more marginal areas, the more mountainous areas, you've got a lot of subsistence agriculture, and that probably covers anything up to about a third of the population. And the other great export of Ireland, particularly important in the Industrial Revolution, as Engels noted in Manchester, will of course be people.
That's really interesting, Kevin, because I wanted to come in on that, because I'm quite interested in that myself, this export of the Irish people. I mean, you know, when you look at the evolution of racist thought, what you know is, you know, at the same time when Black people were being looked at physiologically to show that they were subhumans, so were Irish people. The same thing was happening when they were being imported into the UK to act as navvies. But as I also know, and I know this from looking at my DNA with 10% Irish heritage, you know, the Irish were very prominent in terms of being the overseers on the plantations of the West Indies. And I think that's very interesting to actually see how those people who were once oppressed can also themselves, for all sorts of reasons, then be put in the position of actually implementing, you know, such an oppressive system as slavery. And by the way, I don't agree. Tony Greenstein has just said that he thought that the position of the indentured peoples was perhaps the same or worse than enslaved peoples. I fundamentally, of course, don't agree with that, but that's a discussion perhaps we can have. What would you say about that?
Well, it's funny, just as you were mentioning that, I'd scribbled down in my notes indentured servants. Well, two things. First of all, that racist attitudes, I think, are not solely in terms of skin color.
No.
And it's very clear that that what you have is the idea of this population in Ireland as being inferior, possibly, you know, maybe a very dubious humanity, and particularly a population that needs to be, you know, restructured. For example, there were attempts to structure not only the agricultural system, but ways of life, language. So it's the idea that this group isn't just another group that we've conquered. It's the idea of a you know, a group that really needs to be remolded. That was often phrased in religious terms in the previous period. In terms of slavery, I think again you're quite right, because you have the situation in Ireland itself, where you know, not every Irish person is, for example, a victim of the famine, and many of them will be working with the landlords, with the established order, with the state. So you know, there isn't a simple sort of Anglo-Irish dichotomy there. The debate over the indentured servants, I think, is an interesting one, and I think I tend to agree with you, Jackie, that they're not quite slaves, and there may be, you know, various racial reasons for this, the racial categorization, but we do know that many of the indentured servants are released from their indentures, and indeed, as you say, go on to become overseers or indeed actually owners of plantations and other economic units. This battle over this discussion, and it's perhaps more of an issue in the United States than maybe it is here, is, I think, linked to the idea and of everybody trying to, in a sense, for any number of reasons, sort of jump onto a bandwagon. And I'm thinking particularly of the idea that some Irish American politicians claim that racial disadvantage was greater amongst the Irish Americans than it was amongst certain other groups. And I think latching onto indentured servants who were, you know, in a very bad position, very, you know, clearly difficult position. You know, they were bound to work for a number of years. Many of them died before the term was over. And it was, in a sense, akin to slavery. And many people who were, for example, deported from wars and so on were in effect had become slaves. But many of them also became, in effect, sort of trustees for the system. So I think that I wouldn't equate them with slaves. You know, they're not free labor, you know, and they're in a very disadvantageous position. but the evidence we have is of this different sort of intermediate. As I say, I make the comparison with trustees in a prison. They're not being released from the prison, but they have a certain privilege within that system.
Can I just ask you, maybe as a final question, Kevin, how is the famine seen in Ireland today? Do people see it as a as a political motivator against and for a united Irish country, etc., or is it seen as something of the past?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm approaching my 70s, and my grandparents were born one was born in the late 1880s, another one born in the 1890s, or at least on the ones that I know. And I remember that there were sort of stories about the famine, but as a central feature, the famine is for a long time, I think, was kept, I wouldn't say hidden, but I think when you consider the traumatic effects of it and it was, in terms of the folk memory, I think there was a lot of suppression of it. In the 1940s, the government did carry out some folkloric work, and so sort of memories of the famine began to surface. Politically, I think it was significant in the 19th century. The Fenian movement that emerges in the 1850s and 60s is clearly a product of the famine, both because it draws its support from Irish Americans, but also because it, I think, quite fundamentally delegitimates British rule in Ireland. The argument is that that the British system, both politically and economically and socially, is now completely illegitimate. It's failed. And indeed, the idea of the man-made famine is really reinforced in this period. So I think it does have a political impact. I think there is often a tendency, both in Ireland itself, but also outside of Ireland, to emphasize sort of historical wrongs, as if history is the main driver of the struggle in Ireland. And I would say, particularly in terms of events in the six counties, in the 1960s onwards, the historical memory of past wrongs of British imperialism was a factor, but it actually arose, and contemporary politics arise out of contemporary issues. The famine was one of the contributors. Obviously you can't have an event like that without it having some impact on people's political awareness and sense of injustice. But to argue that this sort of resentment continues, I think it's probably more of an issue in that sense in some politics in North America, where many people date their arrival in the North America from the famine, and so it's part of that type of story. I mean, it's I suppose paradoxical, but in the city where I live and work in Liverpool, large numbers of people are descended from the people who arrived here at that point, some of whom managed to get about 250 meters from the landing stage. The areas in that historic part of Liverpool, which were historically very Irish, remained Irish and remained politically quite significant in that way well into the 20th century. So in terms of historical memory, it's important, but I've said the main drivers are the situation that people faced in Ireland, particularly in the 1960s, as opposed to any sort of long festering historical memory. There's plenty of historical memory to go around in Ireland, and it's one of the key issues, but not, I think, the absolute decisive one.
Thank you very much for joining us, Kevin. We wanted to speak to Suresh Grover about the Bengal famine, which actually is a bit similar. It's got similarities while it's also quite different, but it also had an issue in terms of the British ruling class standing by and taking really crucial decisions to let millions of people starve to death. Unfortunately, he can't make it tonight, which gives us a bit more time, though, so we can bring in some people from the floor. The first person to have his hand up was Tony, so I'm going to bring him in. Hi, Tony.
Yeah, hi. I think the main thing to understand about the Holocaust commemorations is that it's not about the Holocaust, quite simply. I mean, if I can quote, and it's from Gerhard Reigner, who was the main representative in Geneva during the war of the World Jewish Congress, and he said, drawing universal lessons from the Holocaust meant the plunder of Jewish moral capital. He declared that Auschwitz was not only a national memory belonging to the Jewish people, it was also an important political asset. So, I mean, they were absolutely clear. I mean, if you look, for instance, at Yad Vashem, which is Israel's national Holocaust Memorial museum, it's situated barely a mile from the village of Deir Yassin, which was subject to a horrific massacre in April 1948, before Israel declared its independence, incidentally. And there was a guide, Itamar Shapiro, who pointed this simple fact out to people who were visiting. He was a guide. He was immediately sacked because he shouldn't introduce politics into it. And Nir Gontos, a Haaretz reporter, he describes how when Netanyahu was proposing to expel 60,000 black refugees from Eritrea and Sudan, he rang up people, including the director at Yad Vashem, to ask them to say something about it. And he describes how every single one of them angrily slammed their phone down. Yad Vashem has always refused to draw any parallels. On the contrary, one of its main tasks is to actually draw the links, if you like, the comparison between the Arabs and the Nazis. The Palestinian, I mean, Netanyahu went to the extent of saying that the Palestinian representative, the Mufti, gave the whole idea of extermination to Hitler. If you remember his speech to I think it was the 2016 World Zionist Congress. So it's no accident that we see, someone like Eric Pickles, who is the British representative to the IHRA internationally, because he is a thorough racist. He's an anti-gypsy racist.
Tony, can you wind up a little bit? We don't have a huge amount of time.
Yeah, no, sorry. I mean, that was simply the point I was making. But in Israel, I mean, there are very large numbers of Holocaust survivors, and they live in poverty. And the reparations from Germany, which were intended for them, have been stolen by the Israeli state. Because for the Israeli state, the Holocaust is not about the people who died. I mean, that is the main thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very good point to make, I think. Anne McShane was going to come in onto, I think, the Irish Famine. Hiya. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, so thanks a lot. I just wanted to come back to disagree slightly with Kevin on the sense of wrong. I would say that I grew up in Ireland and went to school where I learned about the famine, and what you learn about the famine in school, or at least I did, was that there was nothing natural about it. Of course, there was the potato blight, but that itself also has its reasons in terms of the problems with the soil at the time. Anyway, but like linked to that was the fact that so many, hundreds and thousands, as Kevin said, millions of people either died or were forced to emigrate. And where I live, actually, Cove used to be the old Queenstown, and that's where the coffin ships went to America. And many, many thousands of people also died on those coffin ships. And I think that there is really, I would say, obviously it's like not a topical subject because it's a long time ago, but I think that there's a sense of historical wrong and anger towards the British for deliberately letting people die in such thousands. And you know, the fact that people were thrown off their little small holdings because they couldn't pay their rent, because, you know, they had no money, you know, that you see the photographs of the Great Hunger, sometimes it's called. You see the photographs that were, you know, or the paintings of people that were taken at the time, and you can just, you know, the immense suffering, I think would still give you, you know, that sense of anger. I mean, obviously it's different to other Holocausts. I don't know whether, would you call it a Holocaust? I mean, I think the whole idea of allowing people to die in such numbers, or to, you know, allow them to leave because you wanted to restructure the whole of society, is there something deliberate about that? And I would think that there is. So I think, yeah, that it is an important, it continues to be a historical wrong. I mean, obviously there are plenty of others, and what do they say, 800 years, you know, that the Irish people have never forgiven and will never forget. And, you know, that's something that's shared by other people that have suffered such collective historical wrongs.
Absolutely,
Okay.
and we're trying to pinpoint, you know, why it happens, and how it's often about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, a very bloody transition, but often also about, you know, keeping power or getting into power. So it's very, very rarely, if ever, a genocide happens, or, you know, mass extermination happens by accident. Malcolm wants to come in. Hi, Malcolm.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I would just like to ask Jackie, really, I suppose, and it sort of relates a bit to John Arlett's answer on his form. I mean, do you think it's still very helpful to call people black and white? Because if you look at this picture, you can see, I mean, your skin is certainly darker than mine. I'm currently a sort of strange orange colour for some reason, and Tina is currently lighter than you. Do you think it's really helpful? I mean, I spent years on the picket of South Africa House and so on, and of course in South Africa and the South of the United States, people were actually categorised as being black or white. But I mean, if you look at the colours black and white, very few people are that colour. So do you think it's helpful to continue to call people black and white? I mean, I understand all the things around it, but do you think it's a helpful description still?
I think it's a very good shorthand, yeah. And I don't think it's a conversation of what actual colour we are. I mean, I think that's just meaningless, really. You know, she's a bit lighter than me, she's a bit darker than me. It's meaningless. Nobody is, well, very few people are really black, very few people are really white. But all of these are actually social signifiers. They are social constructs. We roughly know what we mean by black people. We mean people of colour, but actually black people themselves took possession of the name black, and they did that for very good reasons.
I understand all that.
Right.
I mean,
so then, of course, I want to be called black. What do you want to call me? Tanned? Brownish?
I don't want to call you anything. I want to call you Jackie.
Well, no, that's actually, I'm sorry, but that's absolutely no good. Because what we're talking about here is power relationships.
Well, yeah, I understand all that. I mean, but I mean, that's also true of gender. I mean, yes. The reason it's difficult for me to talk about it is because I'm absolutely at the very, very top of any pyramid you can get, you know. And I mean, I have in my family people who have skin color maybe like yours, and their experience of growing up in England is very different to mine. So I'm very aware of all that. However, I mean, Obama was called the first black president, but in fact, he was, I mean, as we know, his mother was European.
It's immaterial. It's immaterial, and that's a diversion. And actually, that's just a way of splintering people off. To call yourself black, to be called black, is about the political, the social class position that you hold. And I'm sorry, but I just see that as a diversion. I mean, you come up with a better name of telling me what I am. You can call me somebody who has my social class defined by my skin tone, but that's not a very good shorthand. So I'm sorry, I just don't find it a very engaging problem, really.
Thanks, Malcolm. I have a lot of sympathy for what Malcolm is saying, because we are striving for, as socialists, we are trying to get to a point where all of that doesn't matter, does it?
It does matter for now.
I know it does matter for now, and it matters much more to you than it does for people who are white and don't have that experience. And it's
that's exactly the problem.
Thanks, Malcolm, but it's a good. I think it's an important discussion. Well, actually, not many.
I mean, I know you've got lots of other people, but I don't want to labour the point. But I mean, I still find it a bit divisive that people you categorize. I mean, you would categorize me as what? White, I guess. Would you? I mean,
I'm sorry, but I'm actually going to say I find it very difficult to be told by somebody who has an identity which denotes them as white, that calling myself a black person is divisive. Thank you. I'll call myself exactly what I want to call myself. Anyway, I think we should go on, and this is a conversation perhaps for next Monday. Graham.
All right, Graham, you need to unmute yourself.
I was going to talk about something else and will do so, but let me just make one comment on that. Malcolm, yes, it's divisive, but there's an objective reason for that. It's because we're divided. It's just like saying class identity or class struggle is divisive. It most certainly is. We're in a divided society, and these are reflections of it, and it takes all sorts of aspects of it. Class, gender, race, and all of these are products of that. But I was just going to try to come back to the point that Tina's been straining to make, rightly so, about the connection between genocides, Holocaust, and the rise of capitalism. It's a pity that Suresh is not here, and we must come back to this. I've just been reading, I hope other people can get hold of it, an excellent book by Caroline Elkins called The Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire. And this shows just how central the murders, say, in India have been to the development of British capitalism in its rise. But it isn't just something that happened 300 or 400 years ago. At the same time as the Jewish Holocaust, in other words, in the lifetime of my parents, there was the Bengal Famine of 1943. Now, you could say, was this a genocide? Was it a Holocaust? Well, I can tell you that probably about 3 million Bengalis were starved to death. And it wasn't just a freak of nature. It was a product of both the actions and the inaction of British imperialism, which put its own imperial interests above those of the people who were killed, murdered. So I think there is a clear link. And Suresh was also going to be speaking about the murders in Kenya, in the lifetimes of the older ones here today in the 50s, and where British imperialism played a key role. And one of the things that comes out in Caroline Elkins' book is how central the empire, or the remnants of empire, were even in post-war Britain, even under the great so-called Attlee government, which was made so many reforms, but actually whose reforms in the 40s depended on the exploitation and murders of the people in the British Empire, especially at that time in Malaya. So I think it's a well-made point about that all of this has got a material basis. And I think that we need to study this in great detail. And I cannot recommend this particular book enough. And of course, we're aware of Tariq Ali's book on the role of Churchill, which I think I actually haven't yet read, but I'm looking forward to reading it, because again, this so-called anti-fascist was up to his neck in the murders of the people who lived in the British Empire. It was central to the role of British imperialism as it was other imperialisms. But I think we've got a particular responsibility in this country to look at the role of the British state, the rise of British capitalism and its crimes. And as I say, and I'll finish with this, whether you call the murder of, I don't care what you really, how you define the murder of 3 million people, whether you call it a Holocaust, a genocide, but I think it's something that is actually something that is probably a lot of people in this room, perhaps even, to some extent, even including me until I read this this book, were not properly aware of.
Can I just add as well, by the way, when I was researching this today, what I found, much to my shock, was that British imperial forces interned, i.e. put in concentration camps, the entire Kikuyu nation in Kenya. That was 1.5 million people. I mean, and what we have to understand about what happened then to the Jews and the Roma, the disabled and the socialists, etc. in Germany, had all been practiced by the British Empire earlier on. Anyway, thanks very much, Graham. But I think now you're going to be asking our viewers for some help, aren't you?
Oh, it's just money. What I think is the big contradiction of Red Line is the excellence of many of the discussions we have and the relatively small numbers of people benefiting from it. And our role, I think now, is to try to broaden our base. And that means a big advertising and promotional campaign, and that means money. Now, a number of people here already do subscribe through Patreon, paying a certain amount every month. The advert is always there on our website and will no doubt be in the chat. And I really hope that comrades can contribute however much they can afford, however small it is, to help us really develop this program, because we've got a key role in the period ahead. It is, after all, one of our big roles is to try to develop resistance in the trade unions, in the Labour Party, but also to help rebuild the left. And that means, and I think it means that we've got some responsibilities in this. And I hope
actually what we
help us build.
And what we want this money specifically for is we're going for some big adverts and some regular advertising in the Morning Star in particular, when for the Durham Gala, Durham Miners Gala, and also for the Toll Puddle. So we really want to do a push there. So please do give us some money. Tina.
Well, we also, and I think it worked really well, actually, audience participation. I think we want to increase that more. I mean, we've got every second show now is going to be have your say. You know, we were discussing the show in the previous week, but we've also done a survey, and I hope comrades can still participate in this. I put the link in the chat now, because we do want your feedback, and it is quite difficult, actually. We have a small editorial group, but we really appreciate sort of ideas for shows and feedback, and we've had some really good suggestions. Obvious ones that are like leading the field is where we're going now. What's the left doing? How can we build a party of the left without tearing each other apart, without, splitting once somebody has a disagreement? And I think our show is trying to make a cultural change in that direction and say, we can have disagreements, we can debate, like Jackie did with Malcolm, we can have differences and we can still be in the same room. We might lose our rag a bit, but we're still, civilized with each other, etc. That's an important discussion. So we will certainly look at that. Summer of discontent. Obviously, we want to have more recent and current issues, perhaps. I mean, we've planned the Holocaust series quite long in advance, but obviously there's other things happening which we want to fit in. The Ukraine war is still going on. Is it a proxy war for what's going on with China, etc.? trade unionism, drugs trade, illegal illegal, making drugs illegal, etc., or decriminalizing them, with an interesting discussion. And we've had some really good feedback in terms of improvements we can make. My favorite one is, how do you improve on perfect? Well, there's always room, I think.
Oh, shucks.
And more audience participations come up quite a few times, but we've already, I think, tried to take that into account. And also, some comrades have commented on us being not as professional technically as we could have been. I think there's a saboteur who came in 15 times today. No idea how. I don't know how he got into the host position. No idea, but this is the kind of stuff we would invest money in to make sure that this doesn't happen, and spreading it through advertisement. But there's lots of room for improvement, and we would appreciate if comrades could help it out financially, but also politically.
Okay, so thank you for tonight. Been an interesting discussion. Don't forget, next Monday it's time that we all have our say, and I'm saying that because really it's you having your say. But I have to tell you that this programme in particular caused quite a lot of disagreement within the editorial board, partly for the reasons that Leah Levain raised last week. And it's perhaps something that we want to look at. How do we deal with issues like this, where we are pressurised to treat a particular issue in one way? I certainly have an opinion. Graham has another. He's got his hand up because he wants to tell you what it is now. But I think actually we don't need that, because we can do that next Monday. So please, thank you. Pay us loads of money and tune in next Monday and see what we're going to think. Thank you.
One thing before comrades go, because there's some comrades are saying they can't work out the Patreon, or it doesn't work very well. I've just posted our website address, and there's a normal old-fashioned PayPal button that comrades can also use on our website, the redline.tv. So that would be appreciated. We do like regular income, because we need to, every month we have to pay a Zoom account and we have to pay out graphic designer. So regular income via Patreon is important, but of course we also like PayPal contributions. So thank you very much.
So have a good week and tune in on Monday to see what we all think of what we've just said. Thank you and good night.
Good night, comrades. Bye.
Night.